Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fifth webinar, A Strong Alliance, NATO and the War in Ukraine. I'm Dovilė Budrytė, the current president of the AABS. And we all know that Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine has resulted in a major change in Northern Europe's security landscape. In April 2023, Finland became the 31st member of NATO, ending its decades-long policy of military non-alignment. Sweden is eager to join NATO as well. What does this historic development mean for the alliance, including the Baltic states? Does Finland's decision to join NATO to secure its freedom represent a possible model for Ukraine? How did the war in Ukraine and Finland's NATO membership fundamentally reshape Baltic security? So these and other questions today will be tackled by some very, very interesting and famous people, including Yevgeniya Gaber, who is a Ukrainian foreign policy expert, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Center in Modern Turkish Studies at Carleton University. Also, Marko Lehti, research director of Tampere Peace Research Institute and an academic director of master's program in peace, mediation, and conflict research, both at Tampere University in Finland. Kaarel Piirimäe, associate professor of contemporary history at the University of Tartu and research fellow at the University of Helsinki. And the webinar will be moderated by Aušra Park, who's professor of international relations at Siena College in New York, and also former vice president for publications at AABS. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very interesting and thought-provoking event. And although chat is disabled, but please submit your questions through Q&A. We definitely appreciate that, and there will be time for the panelists to answer them. So without any further delay, let me ask Aušra to take over, and I definitely look forward to this event.
Thank you, Dovilė, and thank you all who joined us today for this conversation, ongoing conversation. As Dovilė mentioned, this is our fifth webinar that we're discussing important and geopolitical event that unfolded since last year. I would like to start with Yevgeniya, if I may, and would be eager to have your thoughts and reflections on the new regional security environment after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you could provide your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dovilė, for the invitation. Thank you also for the questions. Really great to be part of this panel. Thank you so much. Well, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because we know that the war in Ukraine started much earlier, back in 2014, but with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February last year, obviously the security situation in the region has deteriorated. It's also important to underline that it actually did not start only with the land occupation of Ukraine, because at least starting from 2018, I would say, we've had this creeping maritime occupation of the Russian Federation, first of the Sea of Azov, and we all remember the Kerch incident there with the attack on Ukrainian vessels, and then partially the so-called war of drills and partial occupation of vast areas in the Black Sea, when under the pretext of different drilling and different maritime operations, basically Russia blocked huge parts of the Black Sea. And then it went on, of course, with the full-scale invasion. Apart from that, with the occupation of Crimea back in 2014 and the illegal annexation, Russia turned the Crimean Peninsula into a military base. So with the militarization and the nuclearization of Crimea, obviously we've had another attempt of Russia to integrate its northern and southern so-called A2AD bubbles meaning air denial bubbles, and that, of course, again, weakened the position of NATO states, Euro-Atlantic security generally here, and also in the Mediterranean, because obviously Crimea has been used as the power projection for the Mediterranean. So with all this being said, it's not only about the Black Sea, but obviously about the Baltic, Black Sea, and Mediterranean connection. And I think more and more generally, and specifically in our region, in Ukraine, in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, we tend to talk about this Baltic-Black Sea connection because a lot of different tactics, methods, hybrid warfare, which have been used by Russia in the Black Sea, we've seen the same patterns of provocative actions in the Baltic Sea. So for us, obviously, this is one security sphere. Now, if we have any silver lining in this and any blessing in disguise, then I would probably point out two of them. First, Ukraine, which has always been very clear since 2014 about its European and Euro-Atlantic ambitions, but starting from 2022, we have 80–85% of Ukrainian citizens who are ready to vote for NATO membership. Of course, not now at this point of this hot conflict and ongoing war and fighting, but at some point, I think that there is a very strong belief and expectation in Ukraine that Ukraine will become a full-fledged member of NATO, because it is now fighting not only for itself, but also for the European and transatlantic security. So in a way, I would say that Ukraine has emerged as a high vote for Euro-Atlantic strategic interests in this part of the world. And on the other hand, this is also a huge chance and opportunity for NATO to revise its policies toward the Black Sea region and towards this region in particular, because we've never seen a clear, well-articulated, comprehensive strategy of NATO towards the Black Sea. We've had some toward the Eastern Europe, let's say, different parts of the world, but not the Black Sea per se. So I think something to discuss today as well, and something that has been very often discussed by Ukrainian experts, also in this general context of the Russian aggression in the region, is what is the role that NATO can play? Can we talk about, if not permanent, then at least sustainable presence of NATO in the region, Montreux Convention and Turkey's role in the whole process, demining missions, patrol missions, and so on. So this is somewhere where we have huge space for cooperation, and I think we can discuss that in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Yevgeniya, very much. Certainly a lot of food for thought. Now I would like to ask Kaarel if you would reflect on the potential misperceptions about Finnish and Swedish defense policies. Has Finland actually been closer to NATO historically than it is commonly assumed, perhaps?
Hello from me. Thanks for including me in this great panel. Marko will certainly also, I think, comment on the Finnish perspective, but let me explain on what I can base my comments. I am studying the security policies in the 90s based on the archives of the Estonian Foreign Ministry and some other documents that have become available these days, but mostly on Estonian diplomatic papers, which are really, really interesting. And they certainly also comment on Finnish and Swedish security policies, as well as, for example, Ukrainian developments. And what is really interesting is that the public perception of Finnish and Swedish policies and let's say the reality is a bit different, I think. So I would say that Finland and Sweden have never been, since early 90s, neutral. This is precluded already by being member of the European Union. but also that they have been quite close, or very close to NATO. So that since about mid-90s, Finland has been ready to join NATO almost the next day. Of course, Finland as well as Sweden chose not to join NATO at the time. And there was some misunderstanding concerning whether the Baltic states, for example, should join. At certain point, Finland and Sweden thought it's not a good idea that the Baltic states join, because it would not, they thought, increase the security in the north and the Baltic, but decrease security. But nevertheless, they had to be supportive because Finland, in particular, knew that if the Baltic states were weak security-wise, or also in terms of military defense, Finnish position would be much weaker. So Finland has, and Sweden as well, have been our greatest supporters all the time. And now, well, as we expect, well, Finland has joined already, and we expect Sweden to join very soon. So the question is, what has it changed? There is this perception that it has changed a lot, and certainly to some extent it's true. But on the other hand, Finland and Sweden have been very close to NATO, and Russia has always known that they are close to NATO and also cooperating extensively with the United States. Now, as to Ukraine, I think certainly Ukraine's future lies in NATO and the EU. There is no doubt about it. But I think that Ukraine has to meet all the requirements before joining, and it's for their own good that they meet all the requirements. Right now, there is a lot of discussion about corruption in Ukraine, and we shouldn't close our eyes towards that. It's in Ukraine's own advantage that it's dealt with and discussed openly, because the people who try to deal with corruption in Ukraine actually want us to support these efforts and also talk openly about it. And I'm sure it will be dealt with the right way. So these are my initial comments.
Thank you, Kaarel. And now we have our third panelist as well, Marko. I would like to ask you to hear your views. Please share what do you think about the drastic shift in terms of envisioning security and peace in Finland and Sweden that led to NATO membership, and how Finland becomes now a border state, or is it becoming a Baltic state? So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, indeed, it becoming in a way. I think my colleagues doesn't probably agree that in Finland, but that's how I'm saying that Finland and has bringing also Sweden with it becoming a border state or Baltic state. And I will continue where Kaarel stopped and explain the Finnish perhaps the drastic change which take place after the 24th of February last year. how the Russian aggression was experienced in Finland, how that was a kind of really a game changer from the Finnish point. We were technically ready for joining NATO. We have been cooperating, but it was so much a dividing issue in politics. It doesn't have a kind of a public support. It was a kind of normal political issue was debated. It was not seen existential issue. But the Russian aggression was experienced in Finland through its own historical experiences as existential threat also to Finland. That the Finland could be a next on a line, if not next immediately after perhaps the Baltic states, seen as Finland is vulnerable and created a strong ontological security that all the structures that we have, the trust that are built on a kind of a stability and order and peace in Europe have been collapsed. And what was interesting, and I think that happened in the spring, that quite quickly it led to the very unanimous decision to apply the NATO memberships, and almost kind of fully supported by public. Some 90%, 95% can support that. That's in democracy. It's a huge amount of people. So it was so strongly experiences that this is the solution. And when it was the application was given, and soon some countries started to kind of ratify it, it already given back on certain kind of ontological security, feeling conformity that it was not a kind of, there was still a fear that it could happen that we are on the front line, but it gave different voices to Finnish politicians to talk in European peace. And that voice was very close what I found it in the Baltic state. It is kind of a Finland, in my opinion, becoming quite quickly one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine and Ukrainian kind of a war and that is interesting shift. And I think that to explain that, it's good to look about the Europe, how it's divided in Ukrainian case. It's a European Union and former European Union kind of policymakers stand in kind of a united. The policy and support is in that level is united. But if you look at beyond that level, if you look about how the kind of people in Europe are experiencing the war and their opinions more kind of broadly, we have a clear divisions. And first, perhaps there's two main elements here, which I think they divided the Europes. The first is a question: is this war taking place in Europe? Is it the European war or is it Eastern European war? And if you are in Germany and France, and the way I think about it, it is Eastern Europe. It's a bit far away. It's not really touching us. The war is not the kind of a potential threat for us. It's only that if it escalated in the nuclear warfare or something like that it's more or less about the energy and other issue. And then there are countries like Finland, Baltic states, Poland, now also Sweden to think about, yes, it is really the war which is the issue, that we are kind of experiences the kind of the same existing threat. It could happen us, and we have to take care that this is a European war, not something which happened in somewhere far away in Eastern Europe. Now, other things which is also quite clearly dividing in between, kind of say, the Baltics and Nordics, and then if you look about the Western Europe or Central Europe, is the public opinion. And they support for Ukraine. I think that it's divided there. You have the far right and far left, which are ready for understanding the Russian kind of interest, what the kind of demanding immediate peace negotiation in whatever cost it is. It's a thing that it's very much more divided. It's not, they don't see it as closely. It's something far away. That's I think it's a kind of a very, very interesting. It's influencing also the future decision. But if you look about the kind of the Finnish politician kind of a way of talking about the war in Ukraine in during the past year, it's a voice that you cannot never heard earlier by Finnish politicians. Like our premier, the Sanna Marin, was saying that the only way out is Ukraine to win the war. And what I'm saying that is also the message that we look about how the Baltic states and Finland are talking also in confidential meetings. Seemingly there are no other messages. There is no, when they in other European countries are thinking that we have to get all these kind of a nasty war. We don't like it. It destroy our businesses. So here we kind of think that we have division within the European countries, and they are emerging kind of on the border state, kind of a strong group of the European states, which are experiencing through their own memory, collective memories, their own kind of the war in Ukraine indifferently, and are perhaps given much more support for Ukraine and understanding also they kind of a need also in long term to join in the NATO, which we can talk about later on. And I think that the President Zelensky visited in Helsinki just the last Wednesday, a week ago, it was not accident at all from this perspective. But I stop here.
Great, thank you, Marko. So I have a few follow-up questions before we move to questions from the audience. So first, let me ask Yevgeniya about the need maybe to reconsider the concept of the Ukraine-NATO cooperation, slightly shifting the focus from how NATO can make Ukraine stronger to how Ukraine can strengthen the alliance. What would be your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And also to pick up from what Kaarel was saying, it's very often that that's taken as a one-way road when Ukraine is generally this recipient of assistance. And of course, there is a lot to do on Ukrainian side as well. And I totally agree that we need to have all those reforms in place, both within the process of the European integration and Euro-Atlantic integration. And I think this is also a very wide compromise here in Ukraine among civil society, NGOs, different organizations, that we need these reforms, including fight against corruption, but not only. For our own sake. So it's not that there is a desire to use this fast track just to have whatever we have and then to join NATO. And obviously NATO is a huge support in terms of security to Ukraine, but it's also important to think the other way around, because now Ukraine is basically the only country with the armed forces that have a real combat experience with the Russians on the ground. And this is the first full-scale war, if we're not talking about some kind of proxy wars in different regions in the Middle East or elsewhere, when a European country, which used to be a huge one, more than 40 millions, now obviously 8 million left, but still a big country with the armed forces, which are big as well. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of very well-trained and now well-equipped soldiers and officers who have this real combat experience, who know the strategy and the tactics, who have been quite often training together or also taught by the NATO trainers and the officers, but also sharing their own experiences and very often outperforming on the battlefield, which could actually strengthen NATO, especially here in the East. Besides, it's not only about kinetic warfare. If we talk about non-kinetic warfare, all kinds of hybrid threats, cyber attacks, information, disinformation, and different other types of security, we've been on the front line and we've been dealing with this for years and years, again, starting at least since 2014. So I believe that this experience, starting from very technical, very specific questions like how Russian jamming systems work, how Russian electronic warfare works, which is effective, which is not effective, which weapons is good, which is not. So that's in a way a lab now that we have in Ukraine, up to these skills and real experience of our people. So I think that in a way, if I were a NATO member, I would probably want Ukraine having all those reforms done, all that homework done, join NATO, just because that would also reinforce and strengthen NATO itself and its stance towards Russia. So that's, I believe, is a mutually beneficial, a win-win situation when NATO obviously can provide collective security umbrella for Ukraine, but also Ukraine can contribute a lot in terms of security to NATO.
Wonderful, Yevgeniya. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if this has been headline news or not, but Lithuania today apparently, according to local news, has experienced one of the biggest cyber attacks. So certainly it is an important knowledge sharing between the countries as all are feeling vulnerable. Marko, let me switch to you at this time and ask you about NATO and security guarantees for Ukraine after peace, which we expect to come in at some point, and how Finland with Baltic are countries that are supporting full membership.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm a peace researcher, so I have to think about the way ahead and how we return on kind of a Europe where trust for peaceful kind of future is prevailing. So the trust that all conflicts are kind of solved in peaceful terms. We have that in and we believe that in here in the Nordics and there. I suppose that was not there in Ukraine even before that because we have been war in 2014 onwards, but that is a way which in direction we want to call that they are kind of again and on that this is a long road and they need a lot of different kind of structures and they need to be the whole European thinking on that. It's not only between in Ukraine, but paradoxically I was starting to think about yes. Even I think that in long perspective, it's not good that the military alliance have a very central role in the building peace. It has to be somewhere background in or more invisible. But in this case, it may be so that the NATO membership for Ukraine could be really enabling this kind of a best way or this way to the sustainable long-term peace, which can also civic society can best engage. And what I'm thinking this is here is that however the war comes in, the war comes in some point. Unfortunately, the most we don't know if there will be any agreement. It's maybe so that it's just a kind of a frozen and some kind of a thin ceasefires, whatever happens. But if any point in any times there will be some kind of agreement, it cannot take place without huge guarantees. And that I think that the only possible guarantees is a NATO which can do that, and that it's a certainly. And the best way to do this is that internally to get the memberships, and also to think that further on that if the regime in Russia would not change or it would change for the worse, as it seemingly it's a big threat that how it comes. We have to cope with this kind of a classical question that I think Eho Kaar putting already in 1939 that how the liberal democracies can cope with the kind of authoritarian kind of authoritarian aggression and without not losing their own soul. And not to be too idealistic in the hand, but still, and that's why it's also the question that what kind of language, what kind of messages is the best arrangement is to find a kind of some kind of stability with Russia, if not a change. My first option has been an enlargement, Eastern enlargement of the European Union, and that kind of would take as fast as possible, but understanding the enlargement as a peace processes. As EU has been, the European Union has been peace processes from the beginning. So we should understand it now, not take it as a technical kind of. Unfortunately, what I've already said about the divided Europe and its opinions, I'm not 100% sure that it would be realistic to think that. I think that they were pressured to doing that, but it's not necessary. Maybe it's easier and even better to working in the NATO because it's a strong language. If there will be an end that the Ukraine control its all areas, and that would be end at some point. So then I think the better than guarantee is a memberships, and then the kind of stabilize the situation, and that it looks kind of something which you can think about. And I think that if with a bit listening about the opinions in Finland, and I suppose Kaarel can say that in Baltic states, this is where is you can get the support from these countries for this. This is something which, when you go in public to discuss that, the people asking why it couldn't be happen. So I was yesterday evening talking about with the elderly audiences, and that was question. It should be obvious things that then they should happen. Why not? And I think that is why I returned that the Zelensky's visit in Helsinki. I don't know what they were talking about and how straight we were talking about that, but that is a kind of a, hopefully the support that we can receive from the Baltic state and Finland side.
Thank you, Marko. Now, my question to Kaarel. Kaarel is about possible mistakes that the West has done in regard to Ukraine. And if you might also reflect on the flip side, whether Ukraine has made the right decisions, in your opinion.
Well, it's kind of easy thing to do for an historian to do and point to some mistakes. So one has to be a bit skeptical, but on the other hand, recently, for example, Bill Clinton commented on the Budapest Agreement of '94 and said that he really regretted that agreement that took the nuclear weapons away from Ukraine and offered almost nothing for it. So this is one of the examples actually where you can argue that maybe there was a mistake. And it's not only that later people comment on it, but already at that time there were people who said that Ukraine is actually ill-treated by the West, that the focus is on Russia and Boris Yeltsin, and people don't regard Ukraine as a real country. For example, George Kennan said that he doesn't know where Ukraine lies on the map, and it reflected the general perception of the West of Ukraine, that it's not a real country. And actually, John Mearsheimer, a realist that I always most of the time I disagree with him, but he noted at the time that maybe it's not the best choice to take the nuclear weapons away from Ukraine without any security guarantees. And also the Estonian president at the time was very worried about the mistreatment of Ukraine. But I'm not really a specialist on Ukraine that much, but obviously Ukraine had huge problems at the time. Estonian diplomats reported also on these problems. For example, I think it was in '93 that Russia forced Ukraine to become member of the how it's called, Union of Independent States, or yeah. It was in '93. Can you imagine? It had not joined it in the beginning, so but had to join it because it owed money for gas and so on. And Catherine Belton, by the way, in his brilliant book Putin's People, has also written about how Russia was able to corrupt the Ukrainian government for many years, and only until I think Poroshenko came along, it ended, and also was one of the factors why it the conflict actually became a hot war. So these are my comments at the moment.
Good to reflect on those, because nobody is perfect, correct? So now I will like to open opportunity for you to reflect on some of the questions that we get from the audience. One of them comes from Darius Furmonavičius. who is writing the following. Brussels NATO Summit in 2005 and Budapest NATO Summit in 2008 have decided that Ukraine will become NATO member. Why Vilnius NATO Summit could not invite Ukraine to join NATO? The Lithuanian Parliament on April 6th of this year. What would be the Finnish and the Swedish views on this? Anybody?
Well, I can comment, but I'm not representing Swedish or Finnish views. I can just comment on what is my sense. Obviously, we have this commitment that the open doors policy is still there. So NATO is ready to welcome Ukraine and maybe later Moldova or Georgia. But at the current point of time with the fighting ongoing in Ukraine, it's not possible first to accept the country with the hot conflict on its territory. That's number one. Number two is obviously the whole reform process that has to be done in Ukraine. And though there has been a great progress in recent years, there are many countries which are still advocating for more reforms, including in the armed forces. And what we're now doing is this kind of sectoral integration with the European Union, but at the same time, level by level integration with NATO in a way that interoperability between different kinds of our military people, command and control, all kind of the weapons and arms that we're using there also either used in NATO or are interoperable. So as our Minister of Foreign Affairs put it, we are kind of NATO member outside of NATO because the level of harmonization and compatibility, intercompatibility is really, really high. But on the other hand, obviously, there is a consensus procedure within NATO. So unless we have all countries supporting this, it's not possible for Ukraine to join. And then you have such countries as Hungary, for example, who are blocking even the Ukraine NATO Commission, let alone Ukraine's membership in NATO. So it's not that easy. Of course, again, I cannot speak on behalf of Finland or Sweden. I think that at least on behalf of Finland, Marko could do that much better. But my general sense is that there is no consensus inside the NATO on that. So it's better now just to talk about kind of these security arrangements, security individual commitments by different countries to step in and help Ukraine, rather than talk about the membership. Last point, I totally agree with Kaarel that, probably with Marko, who mentioned that if we want strategic stability, NATO membership is the only possible scenario, because any other scenario would end with empire strikes back. We've experienced that, and of course, I mean Russia by empire, because we've seen that for many, many years, how it happened in Georgia, how it happened in Ukraine, in Crimea, and then in Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine. So if we have kind of a ceasefire, premature peace talks, anything, frozen conflict with Russia, or even if we have territorial integrity of Ukraine restored, but still no security arrangements and no NATO membership for Ukraine, it's just a matter of time when Russia will rebuild its capacities and then attack again. So that's why I do believe it's important, and that's the question to be tackled in the nearest future.
I could quickly come in and well, kind of say that what will be official Finnish policy if this question comes up. I suppose that is favorable, but there are perhaps some cautions. I don't know if it's not coming in Vilnius because of the voice, is hot voice going on. But the Finnish experiences during the past year is also showing that because the NATO is a consensus organization, and you get to have the acceptance for the all members, and they are very different kind of members and different, and Russia have influence within a couple, at least NATO members within that, and that was the last one who gave our ratification. So meaning that Hungary, it is kind of, I think that the Putin has hands in Orban's pockets, deep in there, and their Turkish policy is also quite, yeah, probably we have elections coming on that we don't know what's going on there, but it's also how the NATO is changing, how it's coping with this kind of a different, it's a new position, that question also for the NATO in that sense. So it's not going to be easy, I suppose. There are a lot of interesting questions how we, yeah,
go
let's
ahead.
Kaarel.
Sorry, Marko, I cut you off.
Yeah, I would say that there are a lot of interesting questions on a question sessions that maybe we can pick up some of them in some parts.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, so I would like to direct this one towards you, but Kaarel and Yevgeniya, please feel free to chime in. Besir Vrayet, sorry if I mispronounced the name. We combined some of the questions that were posed by Besir, and I would like to ask, what sort of Russian information operations have taken place in NATO countries, especially since Finland joined the alliance? And how have NATO governments responded, especially in the light of some private sector indifference or shortfalls?
Yeah, I just noticed. Yeah, I think it's been even surprised how little there has been kind of a hybrid attack and policies against Finland after the. So it almost like a feeling that the all kind of energy, all kind of power they have it is targeted on some the kind of countries, at least other countries, perhaps weak countries in Georgia, maybe in Moldova, that could be in influence. That it was much more under this kind of different level of integrating into the different kind of a public discussion, this trolling stuff and all this before the war. Now it's almost a can and or it's not. So that's it's interesting change in. And it was interesting to hear that the hybrid attack was Lithuania. That's really.
If I may just jump in and that very shortly, I think that the Swedish example and Swedish case is really interesting one, especially with the burning of Quran. And that's something how Russian general information and hybrid warfare works. For those who have not followed the issue very closely, obviously, Turkey for some time has been blocking Sweden's membership because of its own security concerns, PKK, Kurdish, Fethullah Gulen's supporters and so on. But then just when the process was kind of getting closer to its final parts, there were these public events, if you wish, in Sweden, with the first hanging the figure of President Erdogan on the bridge somewhere in the city center, and then burning of Quran, which of course triggered huge reaction from Turkey. And then even the visit of the Minister of Defense of Sweden to Turkey was cancelled because of this scandal and because of the huge blow that it caused to bilateral relations. And that then it turned out to be that the guy who was actually involved in the whole action and in the whole event was very closely linked to the Russian side. He was financed. He used to work for some Russian propagandist media. And that was very clear act of provocation. And then very recently, we had this interesting report on how Russia was working on anti-migrant, sometimes anti-Turkish, sometimes anti-Ukrainian sentiments within Europe. So it's not necessarily connected only to Russia or cyber attacks, to undermine this cooperation between NATO and its partners outside of NATO. So I think this is a huge thing which is multi-layered. Sometimes it's mostly about cyber attacks. In Estonia, I think that might be also a question of some population in Narva, Russian-speaking population, because I know a lot of examples there, but I cannot comment on that, of course. So I think they are still active even now, and especially in case of Sweden, that was huge.
Thank you. An opportunity, Kaarel, if you want to add any thoughts.
No, not really. Yes, indeed, there was.
Okay.
Yeah, not much. As I think Marko said, they have hands full of doing these things elsewhere, so they cannot really deal seriously with Finland. But yes, I agree that this was probably a special operation in Sweden, and in general, I think Putin has had several decades to penetrate the Western societies with his agents, just corrupt people, and maybe that was one of his factors in his reasoning, why he felt so confident to start the full-scale invasion, that he thought he could divide the West. Well, he hasn't succeeded that much, but still to some extent. And I think in general way, I think Europe and the West at large needs to do much more to deal with this issue. All the examples of laundering Russian money, the Deutsche Bank, Danske Bank, or people who have really sold themselves to Putin and his regime. I think the West has not dealt with that problem.
Thank you, Kaarel. So another question we have from Ellen Ravshun, I hope I pronounced it correctly, who writes, I am a strong supporter of NATO and US for Ukraine and understand the war to be an act of terrorism, genocide on the part of the Russia. However, at what point does it become necessary to cut some sort of deal to save lives and money that could be used to rebuild and strengthen Ukraine's defenses? What might such an agreement look like?
Well, I can take that question because that's something that I'm very often asked, and totally agree. This is a war of survival for Ukrainians, and that's a war of choice for Russia. So any agreement, if we have this half-baked peace agreement with compromises or territorial gains in Ukraine, obviously this will only encourage Russia for further acts of aggression, because it's not only about getting back on track territorial integrity, return of Ukrainian people, but it's also about justice, because those people who are responsible for these war crimes and crimes of genocide, they obviously have to be brought to responsibility. And this International Criminal Court for War Crimes, which we are talking about now, that's important not only for Ukraine, but for all future conflicts if they happen, not only with Russia, but with other countries as well. But then again, any kind of agreement which can be struck with Russia, that's about territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, so in the borders of 1991, and there are several reasons for that. One is because, unfortunately, negotiations with Russia do not work, and we've tried that since 2014. Minsk agreements didn't work, Normandy format, nothing. We tried to engage with Russia, didn't help. Tried to have diplomatic negotiations, didn't help. Any deal which was signed, it was not kept by the Russian side. So there is no sense in signing any document if Russia has an upper hand on the battlefield, because it will anyhow violate that. But the second very important issue is that those people who live in the occupied territories, they are killed as well. So when we're talking about saving lives, it's not only about ceasefire and not having hot war in Ukraine. It's also about the genocidal acts, kidnapping Ukrainian children from the occupied territories, mass graves in those cities which are occupied by Russians. So if we freeze the conflict as it is, first, that will be very temporarily. So it's not sustainable, it's not lasting and just peace. It's a ceasefire and operational pause for Russia to regroup and to rebuild its capacities. But on the other hand, we will just give up on those people who live in the occupied territories, which means that we will have hundreds and thousands of new deaths of those Ukrainians who are distant Ukrainians and who do not want to submit to Russia and to say that they are Russians. So for us as Ukrainians, the precondition for any peace is territorial integrity 1991, withdrawal of Russian forces, and return of Ukrainian prisoners of war, political prisoners, and Ukrainian children and citizens who have been forcefully deported. All the rest, reparations, retributions, contributions, restoration of Ukraine, reconstruction, International Criminal Court, that can be discussed afterwards. But before we have a change on the ground, and before we have weakened Russia, which will be really interested in engaging and in having constructive dialogue rather than just, spending some time, buying time and then regrouping, that's just not an option for Ukraine. So I think, unfortunately, but we're still not there.
I could jump in and take it, because I've been kind of studying and researching peace mediation and for years to come, and it's really difficult case to kind of to open up any kind of a part to think about how it could be open, as indeed the kind of we don't have even in international kind of systems too much experiences how to end and mediate on this kind of a conflict, the conflict which two big powers. We had to have only an asymmetric civil war kind of conflicts for 30 years, and we created all kind of practices of mediation to address on these kind of things. So how we can really can somehow push and enable on these. If this is something which there is no really kind of practices or models, and people fail. But mediation theory point of view, which we are certainly know that mediation, if we really started to mediate, when mediations come up and some kind of discussion, they need to both sides need to be ready for that. That they both sides understanding that and experiences that they cannot anymore kind of reach the call for continuation war. And I think that we are very far away from that. I think that you explained very well for Ukrainian position that it is a kind of what can. But from the point of view of Russian authoritarianism, I think that and it's also so much putting on a question of Putin's power there, or its own authority is a kind of a continuation of his power and dignity of states, that it's seemingly I kind of see the way that at this point they would be really ready for that, because it actually would mean end of kind of his career and end of probably his real life. Seemingly that it's so strongly, it's not only rational solution, it's very much connected with a kind of identity issue, a power issue, and so on. Saying that, I think that
we are running a little bit out of time, so I wanted to ask you your final thoughts with all the panelists. What would be your suggestions on how we can continue supporting academic communities, scholars, and universities in Ukraine? and also Ukraine's war effort. If you could take about a minute or so to throw out new ideas or reiterate the old ones, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
May I, and also adding to the last theme, and I think as an historian, I need to kind of warn everyone that, you know, future is unpredictable, that every war is unpredictable. So we think that we know what will come, that there is the Ukrainian counter attack. They will free their territory, including Crimea. We all hope that it will succeed, that this will succeed, but we have to be clear that it's unpredictable. We don't know. So it can end with a incomplete victory and not an ideal result. So we need to think of that possibility as well. But I agree totally with Timothy Snyder, for example, that Ukraine is fighting for our freedom as well. So it's up to Ukrainians to decide what they want from that war, and we will have to support, and we as much as we can. And well, we should support much more than we have done it until now.
I could continue and leave it the final words for the Ukrainian partners, and I think they have two things in my mind. I say that first is continuation. Is that if you cannot have it immediately, it's not anyway feasible to have a kind of any kind of peace discussion going on and open that it's we can think about and supporting the future planning. We can create it in Europe with all kind of structures that would enable in the long term and a kind of building a more peaceful Europe, including Ukraine and larger a part of the current Europe Europe which is out of the European Union, and that's meaning investing in the European Union enlargement, invest in NATO enlargement, OCCA, which is have to be recreated. That's one thing, that they created structures. The structures where also perhaps the peace, because perhaps it's a larger peace negotiation. We are kind of a peace congress is going on, where's the current peace. But another level is my final point is not looking for the big, looking at the kind of small thing. That kind of, my understanding, the support for Ukrainian civil society and higher education actors, that the resilience, how the Ukrainians is managed that. It's not only about the army, it's about the rich civil society and how it's supported the things, how it's supported the Ukrainian kind of everyday life, and then course of that, and that we can work all together, and I think this is what we should do, and actually we are doing also the kind of different kind of things going on with the higher education institution there. That we know the best in universities, give their full support and what they needed, and cooperate them, and give but trust also that they know the things, that we are not doing this, that some peacemakers are trying to think about, that we have a knowledge, they have a knowledge, they know the things, but we can have a bit on something support and empowering.
Yeah, let me start with thanking to the support that we already have and that we have already got and still receiving from our partners in Ukrainian society. We greatly appreciate that on all different levels, starting from HIMARSes and Leopard tanks up to very small initiatives and projects. Just as Marko mentioned, sometimes Scholars at Risk program really helped to many Ukrainian professors who have moved from the eastern parts of Ukraine under attack or occupation to other universities. Sometimes that was humanitarian support when the whole winter, and I'm based in Odessa, and we spent it without electricity, without heating, without internet connection. So even such small or not so small things like providing this generator that helped a lot, hospitals, schools, and so on. So those kind of small but really huge things, they matter. But I think that it's also important to make Ukrainian voices heard, and that's again where I want to thank you specifically for these seminars and for this opportunity to spread the word, to talk, because it's very important to have our local perspectives on different things in the world. And what I've seen very often now, we have a lot of Russian studies all over the world. We have many different Eurasian studies, centers for Eurasian, Russia and Eurasia research. But unfortunately, we have very few Ukrainian studies centers, maybe just a couple in the world. And this is where we're talking not only about decolonization of Russia, because we know this is imperial power and we have to deal with this in terms of military confrontation, unfortunately, military deterrence, but also academic-wise. This decolonization of science is similarly important. It's important to have Estonian perspective, Finnish, Swedish, Lithuanian perspective, Ukrainian perspective, not only Soviet, post-Soviet, Russian perspective on the geopolitics of the region. So I think that's also where much more efforts might be needed. And we are almost there, but not yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Yevgeniya. Kaarel?
I think I don't have anything to add to Yevgeniya at this point.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much for your thoughts, for your ideas that you shared with us today. This is not the last seminar or webinar. We will continue as an organization, and I'm sure all individual universities will be trying to continue with the exchange of programs, scholars, and trying to decolonize, as Yevgeniya said, most of the institutes around the world that carry Russia first, and then the remaining of the region as an addendum of some sorts. I hope that some of these ideas that were shared by Marko, Yevgeniya, and Kaarel about warning signs such as divisions taking place already. These warning signs are disturbing in some ways on public opinion, as well as fatigue that is kicking in. There are warning signs with politicians. Next year is going to be big in terms of elections. So there is going to be a lot of analysis, a lot of effort to continue raising awareness on the need to fight those who are threatening peace on the European continent and trying to rewrite rules on their own terms that would not be acceptable for many nations. On that note, I would like to extend thanks to our panelists and to AABS for organizing these events. Please look forward to our seminars that will follow, and I'm wishing all of you a pleasant day or a good evening wherever you are on the planet. Thank you so much to all.